Welcome to the TMRN Time Monk Radio Network. I'm Jules, and today is Friday, the 9th of September 2011. Today we have English writer and philosophical thinker Neil Kramer. For over 20 years, Neil has independently studied philosophy, psychology, shamanism, indigenous wisdom traditions, inner alchemy, occultism, and esoteric world history. Neil's website is neilkramer.com. Hi Neil, and welcome to the WebBot Forum Roundtable.
Hey Jules, hey guys, good to be here, and thanks for having me.
Thank you for visiting with us. The WebBot Forum administrator and producer of the show is Fox, and he'll be doing the recording and technical support of the show. Several members of the forum were kind enough to join us tonight. They include members Chipperdog, Gemini, Formure, Peace for Gaia, and Uranus Rising. For listeners, this interview will assume you have a good understanding of Neil's work, which includes his numerous articles and interviews, including his last interview on Veritas. Neil's website again is neilkramer.com. The interview will be available on YouTube for free on the WebBot Forum channel and at the website webbotforum.com. Neil, are you comfortable and ready for the interview, sir?
I am ready to rock.
Fantastic. The first question we have for you, Neil, is when TMRN interviewed Carl Kellerman, he mentioned that enlightenment manifests as chaos. Your description between machine culture and human culture reminded me of the differences between the left brain and the right brain. Also, interestingly, you define human culture as being spontaneous and asymmetrical, which tend to lead to chaos or disorganization. Is the manifesting speed of events and chaotic times a sign that humans are awakening and becoming more enlightened?
Yes, I think it is. I think that there's no question that if people take a look at their own lives and the things that characterize our lives, like our relationships and our jobs, our friendships, our resources, our feelings, etc., the real hands-on felt stuff, that's changing for most people I communicate with, whether it's on a conscious level or a mainstream level. It seems to cross both boundaries, and there is definitely something that reaches into the interior and is also exhibited pretty strongly in the exterior. So whether you're talking about political events or whether you're talking about galactic events and alignments and comics and solar activity and so on, those things, in my understanding, have quite a close relationship. So the old Hermetic, saying as above, so below, that originally came from the Emerald Tablet, that is very much the case here. And very often, I think that the sign that that's occurring is that there is a correlation between what you see in the news, whether that's through your screen on your computer or the television or the newspaper, and what's occurring in your own domestic life. So I'm very much a sort of proponent of not separating out one's domestic arrangements and scenarios and concerns with what goes on a more phenomenal and incredible and universal level. I like to draw people pretty close together with those things, and I think there is a distinct link between the two. And specifically, as you sort of quote me there, that the asymmetrical nature of human culture, as that arises, it offsets in a positive way, and it upsets in a negative way the symmetrical mainstream culture, which is all based on order and routine and pattern and repetitiveness. And although we all might kind of nod and say, well, yeah, that system potentially has been pretty heavily compromised and it's time for something else, because it reaches into our daily lives, it's quite uncomfortable for a lot of people, and they're not sure what to do about it, because it does put question marks on what you're going to be doing in a month's time, never mind 10 years' time. And, is the basic resources, the basic human necessities, are they going to be met? So it forces a very interesting question on us, which is, can we operate, and can we philosophize, and can we thrive in a perspective that isn't absolutely anchored in self, basically? Because that's the thing that is put under pressure when the spiral of the old system begins to fall in on itself. We have to look at our own resources, of course, because we still need to eat, breathe, and walk around and do stuff. But it forces a philosophical perspective onto the most ordinary of people, quite frankly. So, yes, I think that the speed of events is undeniable, and you can look at Kalaman's formulation of the sort of Mayan temple structures and the different orders of consciousness that may represent, from the galactic to the human and the microbe and the social orders and all these different sets of data that you can represent that with. And yeah, again, bring it into your own life, into your own hands. You can kind of feel it and you can kind of see it. And although you might have been able to talk about this a decade ago, it's very obvious now, and that can be seen in the changes in people's lives, quite frankly. So yeah, I would say that speeding up is a sign of awakening. It's not the sign, but it's one of the sets of statistics that you can kind of map against human consciousness naturally and organically beginning to stretch its limbs.
Okay, thank you. The increasing frequency of events happening around us seems to correlate with Terence McKenna's eschaton, which you've mentioned slightly as well. Some researchers think that it is the human awakening and our increase in frequency that is causing chaos and changes to our external world. Example, changes in the sun is because of changes to us. Others think it is the other way around, and that an external energy is increasing our frequency, such as energies from the center of the galaxy or the move from the Piscean to the Aquarian age. Which camp do you fall in, and are we causing these changes in society, Earth, solar system, etc., or are we being changed?
I think, unsurprisingly, the answer is both, really. So I'm not in either camp, but each point that is made is a relevant one, and you can't deny that there's certain cosmic rays emanating from the galactic center that physically change things and physically change the wave or particulate structure of what we're composed of. So our energetic configuration is undoubtedly influenced by that, and it would be foolish to say otherwise. The thing that's more challenging is the flip side of that, to say that a lot of things that occur in the solar system and the wider galaxy out into interstellar space are affected and influenced by us as conscious humans. For a lot of people, certainly in the mainstream, of course, that is a bit of a stretch, quite frankly. They can't see how that would occur. And the way I approach that is really to say that we're not just little objects placed in the world. We're actually very much something that arises out of the world. So we're here as part of the ecosystem, just as trees are, just as the oceans are, just as the suns are, just as everything is. But what's unusual about human beings, certainly within our perspective as three-dimensional entities, is that we have this peculiar quality of reflective consciousness, of self-referential consciousness, and of the ability to model dynamics, model ideas, and model reality conceptually with our imagination, which is relatively unique as we currently understand that to work amongst the other life forms and entities in this mainstream 3D world. As you begin to broaden out from that, of course, you could say, well, there's a lot of mystical traditions that recognize lots of other life forms, some of them far more advanced than Homo sapiens. And also the other side of that is that the things that we don't necessarily associate with consciousness, like the rocks and the water and the ground and the grass, that indeed does have a very specific and a very real momentum with its own consciousness. And I would describe that as, first density and second density and third density consciousness, which I think perhaps we're going to come to a little bit later. But certainly the question is very much wrapped in the idea that my conception of that, which I've kind of talked about in conferences recently, and also is going to be kind of unpacked in a lot of detail in my forthcoming book, is this 7-dimensional model, and that each conscious entity basically has an ascend movement from the first to the seventh. And it's kind of a journey, basically, and it's a journey to map that. And to a very real extent, the beginning of understanding how this relates to external phenomena, and if, chaos and change and galactic frequencies are relevant or not, is to understand that we're not just operating in that third density, that third dimensional space. That's not the only place we operate on. So there is a reach into what you might say a fourth density state, or a higher state of consciousness, as well as the preceding ones. So it's important, I think, to understand that as you move through those dimensional spaces, you encompass all the preceding ones. So we have conscious dominion in a natural sense, not in a hierarchical sense, but in a natural sense, conscious inclusiveness of the second and first dimensional spaces. And as we transit naturally into that fourth dimensional space, there is a great deal of energy required for that, and there is a great deal of metamorphosis that is undergone, as indeed, as you say, as Kalman and McKenna and other commentators have discussed at length. And quite frankly, I think it's quite a normal process. What's unusual is that it only happens very occasionally at great intervals of time, so it's unusual to be around when that happens. And as you approach that transition point, which is a curve on a graph, it's not a light switch moment, it's something that happens over time, relatively quickly, years rather than decades or centuries, that is. But as you approach that, you begin to see the extreme separation between the old outmoded systems that don't really serve us very well and don't really function and aren't very human-centric, or should I say life-centric as a whole, and one's own arising of consciousness, one's own increase in the quality of how we perceive the world. And as you do that, you begin to see that extraordinary sort of disparity between the two, and it becomes almost unbearable. So whether you're sort of 25 or 65, I think people are starting to feel that stretch now. And that does represent, if you're an astrologer, a move from one age to another. If you're a Mayan scholar, a switch from one time frame to another, one calendar to another. And if you prefer to map it in religious terms, it is the end of an age. It is something that would be fairly classified as an apocalypse. That is just the unveiling at the end of an age. And the unveiling sheds light on what didn't work so well in the previous age. So there is a learning process. So there's kind of like a moral to the tale. And no better way to learn it than to be plunged into the thick of it, right as we are inescapably put into this body. And we're here. And, of course, many people feel that we choose to be here. And it's a sacred experience. It's a precious experience. And there's no substitute for it. You can't look at this from a screen somewhere in the galaxy. You can't holographically do this. You have to actually be committed to it and invested in it. And I think that's the purpose of this flow, is to be thrown right into the transition point. So it is a fascinating time to observe this. And collectively and independently, we each have a job to sort of, authentically as possible, map that progress and that process within the kind of hive mentality and see, how it affects mainstream consciousness, but also our own as well, to see our own failures and triumphs and how that is affected by this shift. So those who exist as human beings, as three-dimensional entities at the time of the shift, are in a unique position to learn and teach, and that goes for everybody, however articulate or however little or much you wish to share that. It doesn't matter how you broadcast your information. It's what you have in your own mind, your own intimate thoughts in bed at night or in the garden or driving the car. Those are the thoughts that map this creation. Everybody has a sort of part to play in that.
Thanks, Neil. I do agree. Obviously, in this 3D world that we live in, it's a closed loop system. So there's obviously going to be feedback. Our consciousness affects, say, the sun, and energies affect us. Now, the interesting point though was you've obviously been around for a while, and you've seen society grow and change. With this shift or change, do you think, realistically, if you look at people that are still watching American Idol, not to pick on that show, but things like that, watching football, do you think a lot of people will be up to the challenge to change, or will they just be so enamored in and just be shocked by the whole thing?
I think it is very distinctly a choice that one makes, and sometimes observing somebody's actions, if they sat in the sofa in this slumber watching American Idol and Simon Cowell and Paris Hilton and goodness knows what, if they sat in that slumber and you look at them and you just kind of despairingly and think, well, you're not going anywhere, buddy, what you're doing just sucks, basically, and there's very little chance of you doing anything else, because anybody who is on a path of their own spiritual unfoldment will recognize in themselves and acknowledge that it is quite a lengthy piece of work in a way. You can't just flip into it. It's not like some Satori Zen state that you just switch into and that's it, you've got it. It's hard work and it takes a long time. And I would say it's probably a 10-year process to get to the starting line. And then it's a 10-year process after that to get to a relatively sane and balanced point of self-initiation. So you're talking, really, I would say, looking at people and peers of mine and friends of mine, some older, some younger, probably a 20-year process to approach a point of basic understanding, kind of like in karate. When you get your black belt, before that point, you think it's all leading up to this point of mastery when you get your first downgrade. And when you do get it, this realization dawns on you that you didn't know anything before, and now you're just at the very start with a certain set of techniques and moves and abilities that set you up for the future grading that you're going to put yourself through. So that self-initiation is a shock to most people, and they perceive it as this extraordinary sort of uphill struggle. And if you are operating in the mainstream, when you contemplate that struggle, it just is overwhelming. So the easy thing to do is just throw yourself into this amazing sort of 21st century smorgasbord, sensual, pornography of every kind: positive, negative, light, dark, constructive, destructive. There's so many things you could just blow your whole life on. It's very easy to do. And anyone who's ever sort of gone into a fabulous library or played amazing video games or is a film buff or is into, painting or gardening, some of those things are wonderful and some of them are stupid, but the ability to get lost in the matrix of the construct is profound. And I think what is missing are credible paths forward for people who do have an inclination to do something and do have an inclination to change. And that's what's missing, because in previous times, particularly in Western Europe, there were these schools, these spiritual schools, that weren't considered religious as we understand it now. They didn't have those kind of hierarchical salvation doctrines. They were schools of personal enlightenment, and they were schools of kind of holistic, ecological soundness. So there was an understanding that spirit and mind and nature interpenetrate each other, and they were very well regarded. And 2,000 years ago, those systems were really crushed by the Roman Empire in my understanding, this is esoteric for some, but as really just a reflection of the Egyptian dynasties. It's the same force, as Philip K. Dick said, the empire never ended. It's one empire that just changes its robes. But what that means is, although that's a study in itself and a book and an interview in itself, of course, it means that we've lost that connection where we can't kind of get out of bed in the morning and think, right, I need to work on my spiritual path. I'm going to go and see my community teacher, who is somebody who is tuned into our community, who knows the land, who knows the people, who understands the specific challenges and adventures of this particular piece of land and this particular frequency range that we live in, whether you're in France or Germany or Bulgaria or America or whatever. Every place has a specific frequency and specific cultural challenges with that. And it's very difficult to do that on the internet. So there's a lot of information around now, sure, more than there used to be. But it's a very linear and impersonal acquisition process. It's only really where you do bring it into fellow experience, where the rubber meets the road, the attainment is brought upon oneself. And that's completely absent from the mainstream narrative. That conversation, that observance is not present in the mainstream. You will not find it anywhere, in any university, on any television station, anywhere. So people, quite frankly, don't know where to begin, and that's a con that the control system exploits, because it is a human frailty, and everybody listening to this and everyone participating in that, you know yourself that when we hesitate and vacillate about something because we don't know how to do it, the tendency is to just drop it and do something else instead. And everybody does that all the time. But when you're doing that chronically with regard to your own unfoldment, and that's a serious issue, and that's why we see this extreme deterioration as we shift. It doesn't always have to be like this, but because there's been this disavowal of the inner work for so long, the outside world is a direct representation of that spiritual poverty, basically, and the crudeness and vulgarity of it is very disturbing for people. So, quite frankly, they're not sure what to do. They'll sedate themselves, and that's a choice, and it doesn't excuse you from making an incorrect choice, but that's an explanation of why that choice is made. Personally, I think there's no getting away from the ultimate choice of becoming an authentic, spiritual, ascendant human being, which is normal and natural. If you deny that, you're ultimately going to kind of snakes and ladders style go back to square one and have to repeat the journey until you do get it. I don't think there's any escaping this, but that only makes sense within the context of many lifetimes of a soul journey that traverses many identities and so on. Within a single lifetime, that doesn't kind of make much sense. But if you zoom out and if you use some of the old techniques to look at that, to get your consciousness outside of your body completely, you can soon understand and appreciate that the journey is a long one, a few thousand years, essentially. And over that time, there are many opportunities to accept that divine path, because that is the only path, essentially. So you can take a very, sort of Mahayana Buddhist view of this and say, well, let's not get our knickers in a twist because everybody gets there in the end, essentially. So if you look at someone who's struggling, just, love them from a distance, smile and move on, because they will get there eventually. And that takes the pressure off the impulse to try and wake people up and share your journey and what books work for you and what teachers work for you. There's no point in doing that, really, because until that key choice is made as a serious philosophical shift that every man, woman and child is able to make, in my view, then they're just playing on the edges of it, really. It's just what I call spiritual Las Vegas. It's just an amusement park. It's just a game, and they're not really bothered, and they'll read, a Eckhart Tolle book, which is great, by the way, and they'll, buy Rhonda Byrne's The Secret, again, which is positive for some people. Very popular books, very easy to digest, and they'll think, yeah, there's something in that, that's interesting, and then just put it down and go back to the television. And that's not appropriate, and that's not adequate. So what shifts somebody from that kind of playing on the edges of the path with actually walking on it is that primary decision in oneself to say, this is something that, although subtle, and although is not defined very well in the mainstream, is something, this spark, this flame, this light that's in everybody. And we all know deep down, and obviously, again, the people in this community that you speak to know it quite well. But even those who don't, I feel that they all know that there's a path to walk. And the depression and the despondency that characterizes the 20th and 21st centuries is a result of continually ignoring that. And again, the positive spin on that, just a silver lining to that cloud, is that it's never too late to make that decision. And in the end, you have to make it. So you might as well grasp it, like right now, while there's this shift in place. And I think again, we're going to perhaps come to this as some of the points we discuss we may cover. But the universe, if you like, the solar system, our galactic community here, there is a kind of fail-safe threshold where it says, right, you've got 6,000 or 12,000 or 24,000 years to get there, and if you don't, I'm going to reset the whole system. And that's what the universal model is designed to do. It's an engine that continually increments with or without us. So we articulate it, but it has its own momentum as well. So the difference now is that people are going to be forced to accept this, particularly with Earth changes that are on the way very imminently. People are going to be excluded from the comfort of being able to ponder this at the weekend or when they've retired or when there's a nice time to do it. You're going to have to do it right now, right today, right in this minute. And that, again, from a transpersonal point of view, is a very, very good thing. From a point of view, self and identity, it's a very scary thing. And those two things coexist at the same time. And everybody is subject to a little of both. But it's certainly a very, very interesting dynamic, and it will be curious to see how that plays out in the social consciousness, which will not be televised and which will not be felt in any other way than going out and experiencing that for yourself. It cannot be measured or mapped on a screen, so that CNN and BBC won't be able to tell us what that goes like. We have to find out for ourselves.
Thank you, Neil. And this time, hopefully, we pass the test. I'll pass it over to Gemini.
Thank you. Hello, Neil. It's such a pleasure to have you join us this evening. How are you?
Hi, I'm very good. Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Sure. You have stated your mantra of letting sleeping people, babies, sleep to awake on their own. Do you suppose that the sleep is actually the machine's defensive mechanism in support of the machine's programming? Further, with the increase of spiritual awakening, are we now at a point of critical mass that those who are lightly sleeping have enough courage to feel okay to awaken?
Yeah, that's connected to the previous point somewhat. So we've kind of gone into that, I guess. But yeah, it's a very important point, particularly for those who are at the beginning of their awakening or ascendant process. And when I say awakening and ascendance, those words are sort of a bit loaded for the more metaphysically minded, and it might turn some people off. So what I'm talking about is human growth, basically, emotionally, physically, spiritually, whatever. And that's what I mean by awakening. And it's a process, not a moment. But definitely those early on in their journey of awakening, in the first few moons of it, shall we say, there's a very great temptation to wake other people up, particularly those you feel closely related and friendly with and so on, friends and family. Those who you care about, you think, well, I can sense your pain and I kind of have some insight now into why you're experiencing that. So let me share with you my journey, because I have gone some way towards diffusing that pain and transforming it, and I can give you some clarity on what's going on in the world, and it should be able to help. And really, in most cases, that just kind of implodes and blows up in your face, really. And I think that it's important to recognize that, as you quite rightly say, I think, in your question, there is a defensive element to being asleep. There is a logic in what we might call spiritual hibernation, where you say, well, I'm going to go into stasis because I don't know what to do. I'm not sure how to proceed. The information that's around me, which might be in the form of Christian or Muslim or Judaic teachings or whatever, is not sufficient. I understand that. It's not going to give me what I want. It might give me some nice moral conduct, whatever, some of the better schools of teaching, but it isn't giving me the ascendance and the awakening I want, not by a long chalk. And anyone who seriously looks at that and asks that question on the electric chair of truth, you can't deny that. That information is kept away from people. So it has to be a situation where a certain set of circumstances and energies align in a person's life, which might be a new relationship, or moving from one part of the world to another, or reading a book, or having a dream, or having an entheogenic experience, or having a meditation breakthrough. When a number of those things align, inevitably in a thinking, open person's life, they will say, right, I realize that I have been asleep. And I haven't been completely ineffective, because sleep has its own function, just as our regular sleep does. But spiritual sleep is something that is quite difficult for a proud person to acknowledge, that you've been asleep and everything you thought you knew was wrong. And people are very stubborn about that, as no doubt you've observed in your own life. People are incredibly invested in that sleep and the objects and routines and illusions that characterize that sleep. And to suddenly pull out your investment and then just ditch it is quite a big ask for a lot of people. So it seems that those who naturally haven't invested a massive amount in the dream world, the unreal world, Matrix, are at a little advantage, because you're thinking, well, it's not like I was, businesswoman of the year and got 15 kids and, I'm on this tremendous career path. Usually that is extremely difficult to break out from. It's usually people who have some sort of affinity with mysterious, with the magical, with the phenomenal, and approached that in a variety of different ways, by being interested in the paranormal, or having a philosophical appetite, or having some sense of sacredness in the land itself. And feminine and masculine energies will dictate how that flows for a certain person. But just to be specific with the point, I mean, you say, are we now at a point of a critical mass of those who are lightly sleeping, as you say, have got enough courage to wake up? I would say that yes, because that critical mass is a relatively small number. What that number is, it would be perhaps difficult to say, but proportionately to the 7 billion people here, I think it's a tiny, tiny and very, very achievable number. And again, one can only really sort of arbitrate truth from your own experiences, not just your knowledge, your gnosis. In my life, the regular people that I meet, let's put the conscious community to one side for a minute, but the regular people I meet, the Republicans and the Conservatives and the Democrats and the Labour voters in Britain and America, as the two countries that I'm most familiar with, they are starting to change their view on things, and they start to say there isn't really a separation between the blues and the reds. And all this kind of idea that the president is this fantastic role that any man or woman in America can find themselves in who cares about the country, that's a total fantasy. So that political framework is definitely beginning to unravel. On top of that, there's also the scientific dictatorship is starting to unravel, in that people are beginning to sense that a lot of the old physics, which is very important, has a very significant purpose, because without it we'd have no bridges or airplanes or refrigerators. That old physics is being heavily called into question now, as is the whole purpose of conflict and war and combat and so on. And I think people are waking up to the idea that the days of empire and of political representation have to come to an end. And they know that. But again, as we said previously, they're not sure personally and individually what to do about that. And again, I'll repeat, when a human being hesitates or vacillates consciously, the tendency is to go back to sleep. So it does take some courage, because essentially what we're talking about here is stepping into the unknown. And human beings are conditioned from birth never to do that. But the spiritual journey demands that we do that. And anyone who has gone on such a journey will be, nodding to themselves saying, no kidding, it certainly does demand a certain movement into the unknown. And whether that's, again, as I say, a young kid or, an old geezer, it doesn't really matter. It's still the same immense movement. And it's a movement that we have to learn how to take with courage, discernment, and so on and so forth. But until that decision is made, then whether it's a light sleep or a heavy sleep, it doesn't matter. It's still slumber. It's still disconnection. So being in stasis at this time of multidimensional earth changes is not a good place to be, because it's not as safe as it used to be.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And I find that the more emotionally attached others are to the illusion, the more difficult time they have awakening.
Yeah, that's right, because the emotional attachment, if you look at it really objectively, is, it's quite an understandable and acceptable thing. Somebody who feels passionate about local politics or local community affairs, or they worked damned hard to get their pension sorted out, to look after the family. To suddenly have that rug pulled out from under your feet is a bloody shock, quite frankly, and defy anybody not to be stunned by that. So to ask that of someone who's particularly invested in that, and it is an emotional investment, you're quite right, more than any other, it is quite a challenging thing to do. So ultimately, you're not really ready until you're ready. So you can't make someone ready. They have to be ready themselves.
That makes sense. I had listened to your interview with Veritas, and you had stated that, in your opinion, that our reality is not organic, but something that has been influenced by the machine. Can you give me an example of something that has influenced our culture from the bottom up versus the top down?
Well, I see that in a slightly different way to how you pose that in that question. I think if you look at things from a very sort of impersonal perspective, you could say that the natural world is a very good indicator, probably the best one we've got, of what is natural and what is organic. So to sit by a river running through woodland with no cars or telegraph poles or helicopters or no man-made stuff, to be in that environment is a fairly good example of what organic looks like. And then to shift out of that, to kind of quantum leap out of that and put yourself in the middle of Piccadilly Circus or Times Square or the middle of some enormous metropolis and see the difference between the two visually. It's stunning, really, the difference. One has a lot of concrete and glass and chrome and right angles and noise and hubbub and colour, and the other one has no right angles and is very organic, and the colour is very harmonious. Colour is very important. I'll talk about this in the future, but the colour is always a bit of a giveaway. And in a natural environment, although you can have this real saturation of red, greens, and blues and greys and so on, and particularly in the fall, beautiful fall over here in Oregon and Washington, it's quite something to behold. But it works together, and there's a cohesiveness, and I think that's the indicator of what's organic and what's synthetic, is cohesion. And you can feel the difference between the two if you go away for the weekend to a natural environment, to like canoe or hike or bicycle or whatever your thing is, or just to walk or just to be there or take photographs, whatever your mode of expression and relaxation is. If you go away for the weekend and do that and then return to a city environment, the decoherent nature of the city is felt in like a sort of energy drop. It's a little bit like air pressure, in that, of course, we know wind is generated by a movement of energy from areas of low to high and high to low, from hot to warm, and so on and so forth. And so where you get great differentials in that, particularly in the ocean, we get, hurricanes, and over the land you get these pinpoint tornadoes. And it's pressure differentials, basically, energy differentials. And it's the same with consciousness. And if you go back to what we said earlier, in that consciousness emanates not only from humans, but from all life, then to be in a natural organic environment, that consciousness has cohesion and has a gentle flow to it. And the reverse, of course, is true, that if you do go into Times Square, somewhere I personally have been many times, so I do know what I'm talking about, the flow of energy is very stark, and it's very erratic, and it's very angular, not only visually, but in the actual flow of energy itself. And that has a depressive effect on one's ability to interact with the energy systems around you, whether that's people, or whether that's your emotions, or whether that's your senses, or whether that's the health of your body, or the sort of veracity of your immune system, that they become challenged in that situation. And the more sensitive you are, the worse that gets. So some people seem to weather the city, no problem, and they're hard as nails, and particularly sort of New Yorkers or whatever, I've lived there for a couple of years, they're, tough as old boots, as they say in England. And that has its own benefits, of course, but that toughness comes from a certain disconnection in a way, because if you do sensitize yourself to energy, being in a chaotic energy environment, and chaos in the sense of total dissimulation, then that is very challenging, and you can feel the difference between the two. So it's really the ecology of energy systems and how they relate to each other. So just going to nature itself isn't enough. It's not going to enlighten you and show you anything phenomenally important until you actually align your consciousness with that. Because if you go in as a modern, sexy, metropolitan, dynamic career person, that's not appropriate in that environment. You have to go in as an empty vessel, as a humble, divine human being. Those two things inseparable from each other, humility and divinity. And if you can go in with that emptiness in a good way, with that purified vessel, then nature is extremely generous and extremely healing and extremely enlightening in what it can provide. But it's a relationship, because you put yourself in that in terms of a relationship as you do with a person. So it takes two energies to flow together to make that actually dynamically function. And in the city, there's no question of that really occurring, because it's not about that. The city is a purely three-dimensional construct in terms of its success and its artistry. But in a higher dimensional sense, it's a very, very challenging environment, and it ultimately is something that cannot be dwelt in indefinitely. And I kind of say that just to temper with common sense. I actually love New York. It's probably my favorite city. But to dwell in it 24/7 all year round, now for me, is no longer viable, because I've been doing a certain amount of work with my energy system that makes that just not feasible anymore. It's not something I can do. So there has to be a distinction between what is cohesive and what flows together, and what is decoherent, and what is antagonistic to purifying one's vessel. And that's really, we can come up with lots of specific examples, but that is the root of the thing, is that. And you can think of any objects in either camp, or any things, or any patterns, or any behaviors in either category, and you can quickly start to discern what is organic and what is synthetic, what is coherent and what is decoherent.
That's a fabulous perspective. I appreciate that. Thanks, Neil.
You're welcome.
And next we have Uranus Rising.
Thanks, Neil, for joining us. It's a delight to speak with you. And
hey, nice to be here.
Yeah, I've been following your work for a while, so this is an honor for me. My first question to you is, English philosopher and writer Iris Murdoch said, "We live in a fantasy world, a world of illusion. The great task in life is to find reality. Finding reality is knowing what is real inside ourselves as well as in the world. But too often we are searching outside ourselves for reality. And given that we are living in a highly controlled and managed false reality or world of illusion, perceptions of reality can be problematic. Would you please speak of how we can build discernment skills and a multidisciplinary approach to looking at and experiencing existence?"
That's a great question. To some degree, we talked just now about being aware of what is coherent and what is decoherent, what works, what flows, and what doesn't flow. And I think from my understanding and my studies and so on, this is what starts to mark out mystical thinking from purely philosophical thinking. And it's actually great to hear Iris Murdoch's name mentioned as well. So thank you for that.
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. Really interesting work.
Yes.
I think all good philosophers have a mystical impulse. And I think it's something that is fundamental to answer this question, which is about building these discernment skills. And as you say, a very important point, the multidisciplinary approach. And I think that is what starts to mark out the mystic from the pure philosopher in a very positive way. And that is why, I've discussed this recently actually, but people like Jacob Boehm and Blavatsky and Gurdjieff as mystics, although they had some occasional sort of trickery and even naughtiness to some of the things they did, what they had over the philosophers was a particular focus on felt experience, on direct gnosis, rather than pure conceptual knowledge. And they also did have a multidisciplinary awareness in that they understood that to build a true picture of what we find ourselves in here and how we can interact with it in a very positive manner, we have to accept that a lot of that data is splattered all over the place in some places we might expect, like universities and libraries and Western traditions, but also in the jungles of South America and in Victorian occultism and in Egyptian mystery school traditions. And some of it's tucked away in Estonia, and other parts of it are hidden in castles in Bavaria. And some of it is in the garden in your own home, where you sit there and look at the tomatoes grow. And some of it is in the relationships you have with people. And they realize that, yeah, you really do have to contact that at all levels, because it actually is one thing. And to just be a specialist in one area, to just study one discipline, whether that's something apparently worthy, like a Kabbalistic study, which doubtless has many interesting aspects to it and can certainly teach you about the way things are pieced together for my money in a more cogent way than most physics would do, nevertheless leaves out things like considerations of Atlantis or considerations of extraterrestrial intelligence, which cannot be left out of the picture, basically. They cannot be left out. And so if you do have the privilege of being able to operate independently as a mystical philosopher, which is, again, something that we can all do quite naturally and quite well, then you don't have any hang-ups and you don't have any beliefs to say, well, I can't say the word divinity, or I can't contemplate this strange mythical civilization Atlantis. You're not bothered about that. You just go where the resonance is strong. So you follow those paths wherever they lead, and you also bring that knowledge into your own domain as you see fit. And that is important principle of this. As to how we actually do that, again, I've spoken about this recently, but the discernment necessary is important, and the discipline necessary is important, because you will meet people who are interested in mysticism who just fly off on some wild theories and say, yeah, this thing about the moon seems very, very plausible, and I'm with that now, but I'm a fake moon person now, or I'm a no planes person now, or I'm a this or I'm a that. And some of those things you could think, well, actually that's quite important, because it is important to look at the origin of the moon, because there's something interesting going on there. Very, very old observance. There's nothing to do with modern researchers, in my view. And there is something interesting about no planes on 9/11. which to some people is just a horrific thought that, what on earth are you talking about? And yet, if you throw yourself into that with no discipline and no scholarly abilities, then not only do you trip yourself up, but you also look foolish to others who might want to listen to what you've got to say and who you might have an interest in sharing and learning from yourself. So there is the case that this autodidactic impulse of being one's own independent scholar, we have to learn that we train ourselves to be a scholar, in that we have to learn how to read and we have to learn how to write and how to cross-reference properly and how to weigh a theory based on evidence or consensus or personal belief or experience. How do we test it? Are those things important? Is consensus relevant anymore, or is it not? Is it all subjective? All these things have to be put into that sort of crucible of your own scholarly attitude and your own mentation on this. And you have to formulate what you think, and you can't really delude yourself on this for very long anyway. You have to formulate what you think is your own best form of scholarship. If this theory is so important, how are you genuinely best to test it? How do you run with it? How does that work? And everybody knows what that feels like for themselves. And it's not just hard work. You have to use intuition as well. You can't just smash everything with a hammer of critical reason, because it'll just, ultimately leave you with very little. You have to use your intuition. You have to use your feminine and your masculine energies. And you have to realize that fundamentally, the principle of mysticism is that these people are attempting to make contact with ultimate reality, which, as Iris Murdoch says, yes, this is a world of illusion, and it is a world of fantasy in a sense. And we can't ignore that, but neither can we ignore what the illusion presents us with, which is chairs and tables and politicians and wars and greed and hunger and so on and so forth. We can't ignore those things. We are physical beings as well. But the key to the discernment skills is to understand that a lot of approaches are relevant and valid to understanding these key observations. And they are, in my view, philosophy is key. And there are a group of half a dozen philosophers, I think, who pin it down very well. And if one is interested in who those are, then you soon come that there's another 12 as well who follow up on some other points. So there's a bunch of philosophers that one will gravitate towards, but they leave out a lot of spiritual material. So then one finds oneself looking at, particularly in my personal life, Zen, Buddhism, and traditions that have a distinct focus on spiritual aspect, like Chinese Taoism, for example. But none of those things have the answer. They have perspectives. And no tradition and no system of exploration worth a damn will have any very hard, rigorous doctrines. So if I come across a doctrine in Zen, I'm dropping that school of thought straight away. If I come across a doctrine in Taoism, I'm dropping that straight away, because some of these things, although they start off pure, and you might look at an interesting teacher like Sung San, a Zen teacher, or of course Lao Tzu, a Taoist teacher, that gets compromised over time, and what somebody might call a Zen school or a Taoist school is actually quite far from what it originally was. So you have to create your own formulation of what that means. And sooner or later, as you do that, and this is the key to the question really, you realize that contacting truth is a transcendent experience. It's not words on a page, and it's not even just experiences in your hands. It's something that moves you completely out of just being Neil Kramer or Fred Smith or Sarah Jones. It moves you out of that entirely, and it transcends ordinary comprehension of the world. And it is fundamentally a union with something outside of oneself, which I would very simply describe as a higher dimensional or a fourth dimensional experience. And you're talking about immediate, like Matrix-style download of a whole concept in its entirety, perfectly articulated and elucidated. There's no need to go through a linear process to get to it. So you can have a fabulous philosopher like Martin Heidegger who goes into tremendous detail and like chews his own ears off, you know, going into like this mind-wrenching sort of vortex of philosophy and labyrinths of intellectualism, and it's just all really masturbatory from a higher perspective. And without it is, and without the spirit element, it loses something pretty fundamental. But what those people do teach us, and I would say Hegel is probably a better example of someone who melds the two quite well, is that you do need some sort of disciplinary approach, and quite frankly, the philosophers teach us well how that works, often better than the mystics, but the mystics have kind of more balls in a way, and that they'll push themselves out into areas that they actually don't know, and they don't really understand, and they don't really have a grasp of, and yet they pioneer in these areas, risking what, but come back with something that a philosopher in his study could never come back with. So for me, mixing those two, philosophy and mysticism, is a sort of dream combination, really. So if you can pick 10 people you like in either camp and study what it is that makes them great, then you can begin to understand what are those disciplines and how can you bring them into your life, because they exhibit them very strongly in their writings. And if they're modern people, you can still see recordings of them speaking and lectures at universities and so on.
Well, that is a fabulous explanation, and I very much like the juxtaposition of doctrine versus the transcendent experience. That's very helpful, Key. And I'm going to hand it on to Peace for Gaia now. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.
Hi, Neil. It's wonderful to speak with you today.
Hi.
My question, I think we've given way too much undeserved power over to those who are working so hard to maintain control. We assume they have much more power over us than they really do. It's a choice to recognize the truth of the matter. In your recent interview with Mel Fabregas, you referred to an unplanned brokenness where people are no longer automatically buying into the illusory control system, and how the mainstream media circus is no longer working to divert our attention away from what's really going on. Can you please speak more about this? In particular, do you see any signs of a sort of organically manifesting awareness of the falsity of the great illusion in the general public?
Sure, yeah, that's a great question. There is an element of unplanned brokenness, as I have termed it, in the situation we now find ourselves. And I think that if you go to the top of the control system, as I call it, this group of intelligences who want to contain human consciousness in a very narrow field for as long as possible, then there is an awareness at that level that there does come a point where the old structures won't hold together anymore, no matter how devious and clever anticipated. It doesn't mean they can stop it from being broken, but it's anticipated. So referring to that conversation I had with Mel, there is some unrealness to the meltdowns, and certainly leading with the economy is a very clever way of diverting one's attention from the real issues, which are social issues fundamentally. Nothing to do with commerce, they're to do with society. And the control system binds those two things very closely together. So it says for a successful society, you need healthy, vigorous, aggressive capitalism. And here's the proof of it. Here's America and how great they did. And look at China, how they're booming. And look how, Russia's managing to achieve some interesting things. And look at the weapons these people have. And there's a close relationship between the two. And so, again, we come to that question that if people are not sure what to do when they realize that the system is is broken and that there has to be another way, there's a very distinct temptation to go back to the old ways. So you hear this rhetoric at the moment with the collapsing systems of capitalism, and it isn't capitalism as a political ideology. It's just modern society. Whether you see it as socialist or capitalist is completely irrelevant to me. It's just a total illusion. But modern society doesn't function. It's come to the end of its natural life, and kind of like I don't want to say anything that might bring litigation against him, but kind of like Apple iPods, there's built-in obsolescence in them. So if you buy a sexy new machine, whatever it is, from whatever manufacturer, the likelihood is that your MP3 player or your smartphone has built-in obsolescence. In other words, it has a sort of self-destruct mechanism. Not literally, of course, but it will come to a point where it's no longer fit for purpose. And that is a design from inception. And our society in the mainstream is the same. And so I would say that the people who are putting this together have various iterations of that society that stretches through several thousand years. And the latest iteration of it is coming to a conclusion. And that's well known, and that's strategically anticipated in advance. And so one of the things that they can do with this is use it as an opportunity to reorganize and centralize and come up with the next iteration, basically. And they use various catastrophes to achieve this. And you can go back and look at this and see how that would function historically and get some sort of precedence on that. But you have to do it from an esoteric historical perspective. You can't just do it through the history books because they're well obscured, of course, on purpose. But essentially, the system is designed to break down from the start. The unplanned element of that, though, is that they don't know how it'll break down, and they don't know quite what bits are going to fail first. And I think that what is particularly challenging is that a lot of what some people would consider the New World Order or the Illuminist groups who operate within the control system, a lot of those people don't actually know the big picture. They don't appreciate that there's a higher dimensional perspective to this, what some people might simply just call a spiritual perspective. So not only is there a shift at this point of obsolescence of the old society, but it's also galactically aligned with a shift of dimensional obsolescence, if you like, or a dimensional transcension, if you want to give it a sort of more positive spin. But it means that those who are invested solely in a 3D, work hard and have nice things lifestyle are going to really, really be challenged over the coming times, the coming days. Really, really seriously, profoundly challenged, because that is really a very, very old way of thinking now, which in British philosophy, you would say that is what we would call the Protestant work ethic, which is what modern American society is founded upon, which is basically a sort of sociological, economic concept that you could say is associated with a guy called Max Weber, or Max Weber, if you want to give it the English pronunciation, who was a German political economist. And he basically put forward a work ethic and said a modern society with moral and spiritual uprightness works hard. And in fact, those people who may not get saved from a religious perspective can increase their chances of getting saved and of leading a spiritually moral life by working very hard. And that, of course, from a esoteric researcher's point of view, is very dodgy indeed, to say the least. And just to give you an idea of this guy's views about how this functions, he did once say words to the effect that the state as an entity, and we can say that as our totalitarian states of Britain and America at the moment, which I think is not really disputable anymore, can successfully claim a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. And that is what really marks them out. And this guy's emphasis on hard work as a means for spiritual and social success is a total fantasy. It's total illusion, and it's extremely destructive. And if you want to go to an ideology that is failed, it's that Protestant work ethic. And I'm not saying Protestant strictly in the religious sense, because there were Catholic equivalents of that. But this distinctly Calvinist and Lutheran theology brings about why everybody's always talking about jobs and employment and pay and wages and unions and pensions and insurance and mortgages. It all comes from this fiction of working hard improves your chances of going back to God, essentially. And if you follow that up and take a look at it, it's quite scary and quite amusing, but it's certainly been very persuasive. And that's the thing that is now chief amongst all others, in my view, failing to persuade people, is that people are thinking having nice things and working hard isn't good enough. That is not a good life, and that does not represent any sort of high moral conduct, or in Buddhist terms, right livelihood. It's not a respectable way to carry on. And people are beginning to distinguish between clean money and dirty money as well, so that most of what we see in the corporate edifices is dirty money. It's gangster capitalism, basically. And I think that is very clearly understood now, and people are beginning to refuse to take part in that and do not want anything to do with that anymore. And it's not just the working classes who were perhaps socially excluded from that a little bit. It's also the middle classes who have lost faith in it. So when that happens, there's a very fast decline. So for Obama to harp on about employment and for David Cameron to harp on about employment is just laughable, because that is not the point of this, really. The point of it is that, as we said before, the successful ecology of a society depends on a certain consistency of population and a certain togetherness and a certain ethic and a certain shared visions. And when you have massively overpopulated communities and societies with deep fragmentation, all that stuff is lost, and there is no shared vision, and there is no togetherness in any way, shape or form. And that's the bit that's breaking down, I think, much faster than anticipated, because people are seeking that out. There's an inbuilt desire in human beings and an inbuilt understanding that successful social interactions, and we are social creatures, however much you might enjoy your own company, it is important to interact. Successful interactions are based on certain types of communities, and population size is very significant for that. And anyone who's ever gone to a brilliant European or American or otherwise village where everything is cool and the people noble in the true sense of the word, and kind and courteous and intelligent and open-minded, that is based on many things, but one of them is a consistent level of population. Sure, people come and go, people move back in, people get born, people die, but there's a consistency there, and that consistency evolves naturally over time. And if you explode that out into the craziness of where I was a few months ago in Queens, New York, there's no consistency there, and there's no valid community there. There are pockets, of course, and there's always people who challenge that defiantly and brilliantly and make their own communities, their own oasis within this craziness. But as a whole, the community doesn't function because it can't, because it's too fragmented. So I think people are beginning naturally now to say the government have no idea what a successful community is. And the state, in fact, is not actually interested in developing and encouraging successful communities around America and Europe and Britain and so on. It's not actually interested in that. It's interested chiefly in commerce and corporate entitization of people. And people don't want to do that anymore. And the middle classes, when they begin to drop out of that farce, then it begins to deteriorate very quickly. So those are the signs that we see. The other reverse side of that is that people with imagination and devotion and courage begin to create something new, just like you guys are creating this forum and participating in this, are educating yourselves. People start to do that, and they start to bring it out into the physical life as well. So they'll think more rationally and more judiciously about where they buy food from, and they might consider stopping going to the evil supermarket, to put it bluntly, and buy from, you know, people who live in their community, and maybe even create a system of trade where it's not based on the dollar or the euro or the British pound. It's based on something more balanced and more equitable than that. So there was a case really recently in Italy where one little Italian community has declared itself a principality separate from Rome, and they've even issued their own currency. This was just a few weeks ago, not long at all. And they said, we're sick of these pathetic, backhanded and, you know, evil, to use that expression. I think that was the word the Italian guy used, austerity measures, which essentially rise from corporations who have mismanaged the funds of the people, not only their own funds, but the funds of the people themselves. And so they've completely had enough of it. And so they are separating themselves out from Rome, from Italy as a whole, and saying we're going to do things our own way, with our own money, with our own, you know, system of governance. And that happens very, very quickly. And once that starts to occur, whether it's organically or whether it's very strategically organized, when that occurs from real people with real authentic behavior, it catches on very, very quickly. And that is starting to occur. Those things are starting to pop up. You have to seek them out. They're not massively publicized, of course, for understandable reasons if you're wanting to control people. But if you go and look at that, communities that are declaring themselves distinct and independent from the country that they find themselves in, that is starting to increase. And that is a very positive, organic manifestation of awareness.
Wow, I can so relate to everything you just said. I really think that it's sort of an inbuilt design almost, that the system, as it falls apart and people are sort of forced out of it. For example, I've been unemployed for a whole year, and when that anniversary date came around, I just looked back over the past year and thought, oh my God, I can't believe, first of all, it's been a whole year. And also, the thought of going back into that system, that 9-to-5 matrix thing, I just can't. And so I think people are, in a way, having to respond to their circumstances and reprioritize their lives in a way that, like you said, doesn't necessarily go along with the plans that the powers that be might have for us.
Yeah, you have to have a lot of courage to do this, and you have to do something which is very unusual, which is like accept uncertainty, because as young men and women, we were taught to plan for your future as heavily as possible, and to put resources away that give you security. And I think again, part of the brokenness is people have started to figure out that is not actually operable. And that anyone who's in the 20s and 30s, particularly today, is probably never going to see or use a pension ever in their lives. The days of working hard and retiring at 60 are over now. That doesn't work anymore. So, you know, that's been heavily observed, even in, you know, relatively sort of idyllic rural communities where you think, oh, well, surely they're not going to be affected by that. No, everybody is. So this guy, I've just pulled his name up. His name's Fabrizio Giacomini. And it's Filatino deputy mayor in Italy, so you can check that out and look it up. But if you just Google it, you'll find it. It's really interesting what they're doing, and you can see the courage in these men and women's faces, and you can see, you know, particularly operating under the ludicrous, absurd premiership of Silvio Berlusconi, who should, you know, if anybody wondered how European politics has gone completely insane, you just need to take a look at the Wikipedia entry for this man.
Yeah, so that kind of leads into my next question. speaking about doom and the way people thrive on dwelling in all the bad news, and
Yeah.
there seems to be this unspoken agreement that the current system is going to come crashing down to chaos, after which we'll all be left picking up the pieces. And that's just not what I see at all, which goes to what you were just speaking about. Rather, there are many positive responses already happening right now in reaction to the dysfunctionality of this current system. And in my mind, there won't be a chaotic collapse followed by rebuilding from disaster. Rather, there's an ongoing adaptation in response to the failures of the current system as it slowly dies away. And so, the new is being built right now as people react to the downfall. And the powers that be seem to be attempting to present the image of collapse as the only alternative to the current system. And their version of collapse includes drama, fear, war, famine. And this is really just the same old dying meme. And I guess you've already addressed this in some of your prior response, but what do you see happening in response to the old system slowly dying away? Do you have any more examples or anything to add to that idea?
Yeah, I think there's something important to recognize with that, because there's no doubt about it that the existing system, which is not designed for the benefit of humankind, definitely upholds this very false dichotomy that says, okay, you either have Obama, Cameron, Berlusconi type order, political order, social order, or you have Mad Max chaos with people riding around on motorcycles shooting each other in the face. Which one would you like? Now, given those two options, everyone would vote for the former, of course, because nobody wants to see violence and rape and pillaging and looting out there. Nobody wants that. The con is that I believe, and this is something that I have in my travels around the world, I've yet to see this completely upended as false. In my understanding, human beings are a pretty positive bunch of people on the whole. And although some of them are asleep, and although some of them are naive, humans are very resilient and are very adaptable and are extremely creative, particularly under pressure. And whatever else we might be, those are some tremendous advantages in times of change. And I think we can draw on those to say, finding yourself in different communities around the world, we're given these false filters to say, well, some people are, a lot nicer than others. And, it's all sort of, dependent on where you're born. If you've got all the privileges of being born a white middle-class American or a white upper class British person living in, a lovely big house in Berkshire somewhere with somebody cooking you dinner every night. Well, that's great. Or you could be born like penniless in India or Chad in Africa or something. And I think, yeah, of course, there's demographic and economic concerns to that, but those are based on commerce, essentially. If you remove that from it and go to the spirit of the people and go to the underlying principles that run throughout this, I have been stunned, basically, on how essentially good people are. And that is something that gets quickly lost when one does, a certain amount of conspiratorial research and stuff. You start to think, well, people suck, everyone's asleep, we're on our own, let's create a little group so we can all just, help each other and ignore everyone else. I think that has to be carefully considered, because given a certain amount of a level playing field where there isn't, immediate horror, people generally use that resilience and that adaptation to do something positive and to assist each other. So I think there isn't going to be a collapse in the sense that it's an economic collapse and everything goes to pot. I think any collapses that come would be a collapse like a tree will collapse in a forest, and it's part of the forest's evolution. So if the volcanoes go off and comets come round and UFOs land and there's a huge flood and half the world is put underwater, then that is a collapse. But it's nothing to do with the government and it's nothing to do with economies. It's something totally different. And you could say, even taking potential weather modification technology out of the way, you could say that a lot of this stuff is natural, and if the Earth wants to do a dance, there's nothing that the control system can do about that. It can mitigate some of the circumstances, and it can try and shape the perception of these things. And you get all this nonsense, of course, about global warming and what aspects of it are man-made and what aspects of it are natural. The sort of treachery of the people who are putting those statistics out is just laughable, and I just hope that everyone understands that. Believing that the control system will give us a clear view of what is happening, particularly if there is natural cataclysm and natural crustal movement and so on, is naive to think that we'll ever get a clear view of that. You kind of have to, again, find it for yourself. And in those sort of times, as people in England of a certain age, usually sort of 60, 70, 80-year-olds will say, some of the best community spirit was exhibited during and after the First World War and the Second World War. And of course, there's lots of synthetic aspects to that in terms of the control of people and the fakery of the war themselves, and who the Germans and the British were actually working for and so on. But if you just put that aside as a separate issue to be dealt with in a separate manner, if you actually look at how the communities put up with stuff, particularly in Britain, where they have this totally bulletproof sense of humour in even the very darkest of times, which is just one of the most wonderful things about British people, then that is, to me, is testament that no matter how hard you push humans, some will crack, but some will resist, and they'll adapt, and they'll change, and they'll always kind of win over in the end. So it's kind of like one of those films where at the darkest hour you think, well, how the hell are they going to get out of this one? But they always do. They always do. So I have a very positive attitude about collapse. And I think that if you look carefully enough and make the time, go and look at what is happening in Italy and Greece and Britain. Look at the communities who are starting to separate themselves from the state. How are they doing it? Why are they doing it? What technologies and resources are they using to achieve that? Who's paying for it? It's a very positive story, and it's all there, but it's never broadcast. You have to go and find it for yourself.
Yes, thank you so much for that answer, and I agree. I think when humans are put up against the wall, or when they seem at their most hopeless, that's when we do our best. When we're faced with a challenge in a community, that's when people have the opportunity to do something different. So in a way, sadly, that might be what it takes, not only for something different to happen, but for people to have the opportunity to respond in a different way.
It definitely does, and you have to understand that there's a distinction between what is good for the ecology of consciousness on this planet and what is good for the individual. There's a line between the two to some extent. So if you do have, a family to look after, and you're concerned what on earth will that mean when the supermarkets are closed and there's no power and there's people, behaving in an inappropriate manner, what will that mean? Of course that we have to consider those things, because we have those impulses and responses to protect and survive at a very rudimentary level, but it's very powerful. But as people who are engaging in philosophical perspectives, we have to also set ourselves outside of that for a moment and look and say, well, this can't continue. It can't continue where we support 7 billion people, many of whom are in dire poverty, many of whom, are struggling to know where the next meal is going to come from. We forget that in Britain and America so often. It's something that can't go on. So if the planet is about to reset itself in a very dramatic fashion, okay, that's understandable. Whether that is something that is an acceptable and profitable way for human civilizations to continue is another question. But we're not just talking about humans. We're talking about, as I say, a whole ecology of consciousness where, there is billions of plants who are probably pretty fed up with humans by now. And there are billions of animals who are probably also pretty fed up to the back teeth of human behavior now. So we have to own our responsibility for our part in this, even from the perspective of disowning our own spiritual evolution or turning the other cheek when something bad goes down and thinking, oh, well, I better not get involved. We're all responsible for this. It's not just the control system. They are the sort of solid projection of our disownment in a way. Jung used to call it the shadow projection. I call it the void, because it's a very physical thing. It's not just psychological. It's not just a mental aberration. It's not just a mental construct. It actually is a physical thing. And the universe does that when you're near a point of transition.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to pass you over to our resident poet laureate, Chipper Dog.
Hi, Neil.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us tonight.
You're welcome.
I'm just really pleased with being part of this and listening to your thoughts this close up. And I've been reading and listening to your words, and your thoughts trigger my thoughts, and my thoughts tend to dance in rhyme. You said, be discerning and sovereign, be open and fluid, become familiar with the innate psychic agility that extends throughout every fiber of the physical body. By gently holding one's own unique frequency of creative, integral presence, we resonate and thus communicate with every living thing that shares our harmonic. I just think that's such a beautiful thought, and I've personally been trying to hold an intoned Om since '81. And my thoughts on reading, I forget the name of the title, Death to Videodrome, possibly, or this, Death to Videodrome, long may it wave. Consciousness is as monad as an energetic pulse, unentitied in splendor and single as two convulsed. In the moment of this motion, is an only child, seeing in a mirrored lens a side that is grown wild. The brain-body interface is precipitant of a field, bringing into movement what in quality it will yield. Non-stop commotion tends to hide highly subtle feel and turns a gentle sloping walk into a bumpy ridden wheel. Are there any structures worthy of note between the brain-body condensate and the sea field? Is it really one, two, or many? Is there a structure to that which comprises that represented by concept of and lived as human? Is the next stop universal consciousness with no intervening levels?
Wow. I think that's possibly the best question ever that I've ever been asked. So thank you for that, Chipper Dog. That's awesome. Very poetic indeed as well. I'm not quite sure where to begin with that, to be honest. Yeah. Well, I think there's two ways I'd like to approach that question. One is something that I think you might resonate with, and I think might be edifying to everyone else who listens to this, which is, I think there's an understanding that when we're talking about such fundamental structures of reality and what is occurring in our lives and what is occurring in the collective and what happens after we phase out of this place and fundamental philosophical, spiritual wisdom, then it's ironic, really, because, of course, we have to use language to approach some of this, which I know we're going to perhaps touch on that a little later. But really, my attitude is using language, again, to refer to a Zen principle, to kind of point at what's going on. You can never really articulate it, and you can never really pin it down. But you can assuage people's concerns, and you can inspire people, and you can give people the confidence to go out and do stuff for themselves by using a certain poetry in the words. And I think that's very beautifully reflected in your question. And I feel the same way, that ultimately, rather than trying to make this academically very sophisticated, it's kind of better to approach it from a poetic point of view and leave a little bit of room for interpretation in that, because it isn't a binary thing, this, of 0 or 1, right and wrong. It doesn't work like that, and I think everybody is aware of that now, or is certainly developing that realization. So my answer about the connection between the brain and the body and the C field and is the next evolutionary stage to move from a small consciousness to a vast, expansive consciousness. I think I would say I have this phrase, create the space to receive the signal. And I think that's a very powerful resonator, those few words. And there's a lot of interpretation there, which people can bring into their own minds. But fundamentally what it means is everything that we kind of want to know is already there.
Right.
And everything that we want to achieve is to some degree already achieved. And you hear this word like remembrance quite a lot now, to remember who we are and what we're doing here. And I think that's what I'm hinting at with this create the space to receive the signal, because all those signals, all that contact with all that wisdom, that sacred gnosis is all there. It's right there at our fingertips, more so than any web page or any magazine or any book on a shelf. It's there in a very fundamental way. It permeates us all the time. But to make contact with that, to actually bring that into any sort of meaningful manifestation in our lives, we have to create a space. We have to create a space to receive that signal, as it were. And that is part of the path of wisdom and unfoldment. And it's part of the human architecture in a way, and it's something that we're very capable of doing. But to get to that point, we have to jettison a lot of stuff from the old system, and we have to begin to move away from mainstream media, which completely fractures any possibility of creating space within one's own mind and spirit.
Oh, I so agree. It's when you have all of that input coming in at you, you have no time or space left to hear your own resonance.
That's right. It's absolutely right. And I hold my hands up here. It's easy to say this, and it's quite another thing to do it. And particularly if it's not just yourself that you're looking after, that, you've got two teenage kids, let's say. I haven't, but if I had, I can imagine having, nephews and nieces and so on, what a tremendous challenge that would be to not expose myself to that television media, and also to consider the question of, well, is it my responsibility to limit their access to that, or should I leave that to them? At what age are they capable of making that decision? Because they could be like 50 and they still haven't figured it out.
Yeah.
So, so that is a challenge. And if anyone listening to this finds himself in that situation, you are there by design, not by misfortune, but by design, to help figure out that issue, help to resolve that quandary. Because it is something important.
Back to the cohesiveness that you're talking about, is that it's a fractal turning back in on itself to grow even stronger, possibly.
Yeah, it is. And to some extent, you're obviously comfortable using that language, and I completely get what you mean. For someone who isn't, who doesn't quite get that kind of language and what that means, you have to give it them as a very definite experience. And you could say, let's just imagine for a moment that if you said, okay, I can give you the technique to go into a fourth dimensional space or a fourth density state, and from that place you can completely know a thing. Like, you could see it as like remote viewing style, or you could know it like gnostically, right, or you could experience it, or you could communicate with it. And it's like instant and complete, and there's no linear acquisition process to do that. If I could teach you that technique, you wouldn't necessarily need to read a book again unless it was for your own pleasure or the satisfaction of doing it the old style way. And if I could say I can increase the quality of your life and the depth of your fulfillment from the things in your life and the people in your life, but you have to stop watching television, then people would say, well, that sounds quite interesting, but you'll have to prove that to me. And the challenge with that is that you can only really do that with sort of one person at a time, and it takes a long time. So you have to accept that fundamentally that journey has to begin from within each person for themselves. And so really, you can only ever sow seeds with people, and you have to do that very judiciously, or otherwise you end up just pissing people off. And we don't really want to do that. But you can sow seeds, and you can share very well shaped and crafted pieces of wisdom that have been around for a long time. There's a reason they've been around for a long time, because they work. And it is important to detach oneself from the mainstream media, because that is where the signal interference really arises from. And if you want to look at it from a very conspiratorial point of view, it's actually quite physical, that as well. So even the presence of pretty much any sort of electronic device, like a cell phone or your Wi-Fi signal or this, that, and the other, let's just say this: it's good to get away from that every now and again. If you resonate in at a very high, independent, sovereign frequency, I believe you can get away with murder, and you can plunge yourself into this electronic soup and still get away with being an independent, sovereign being. But it's good to have a vacation from that. So from time to time, go away from that, or turn all that stuff off in the house. You know, take the battery out of the cell phone, turn the router off, you know? Right. And that has an effect, and that increases your ability to receive that signal of the real world, of the fourth dimensional space. And fundamentally, it promotes that relationship with your higher self.
Well, I'm going to follow up with a question. I've been following a yogic path for, forever, it seems like. And in Patanjali Sutras, number 49, it says that all essential meanings are known by the inner perception born of spiritual delight, and all matters are known by the inner perception born of sound and awareness. Being as I've been rhyming words pretty much nonstop for 2 years, I would tend to agree with this. Does it match at all with your own experience on your journey? Would this be what has been termed the Akashic Record? And you've answered all of that. You know, in what you've been saying tonight, you've already answered most of what that question was asking.
Yeah, but it's a very important question that merits particular focus, I would say, as well. So I'll try and do that. I think this idea of the Akashic field, or the quantum field, or the consciousness field, the C field, whatever, there are many different ways of describing this, but fundamentally it's something that exists outside of the restraints of temporality and of regular three-dimensional space. So it's something where there's no time constraints. And when we say you could get a Matrix download of, if we refer to the movie How to Fly a Helicopter, say, you know, there's no time involved in that, because when one moves one's consciousness into that fourth dimensional space, there's no time restrictions in how that information is put in, because it's completely outside of that. And for a lot of people, that's a very, very difficult concept to come to grips with. And most people's contact with fourth dimensional experience, there's a handful of them. The first one is at birth, which most people can't remember. The last one is at death, which most people, you know, it's a pretty one-way ticket, that, in terms of bringing that back to this identity. But in our daily lives, we have dreams, and many of those dreams are fourth dimensional experiences. And they're not just mental, you know, frameworks that the mind splutters around in to make sense of the day. Some of it is, of course, some of it is just crazy montages of your anxieties and dreams and fantasies and so on. But some of those dreams are actual four-dimensional encounters. But they're quite spontaneous, those. And it's very difficult, unless you're some kind of like Carlos Castaneda committed 20-year individual, to actually develop strong, consistent, lucid dreaming. It's very difficult, that.
Sure.
The most planned and strategized ways of moving consciousness into the 4D is using meditation techniques. and not in the necessarily old-fashioned sense of sitting down in, seated posture for like years on end, but actually a meditative principle in most things that you do. So whether you're washing the dishes or driving the car or whatever, you can successfully do those things in a safe and effective manner, but you can put your mind into a meditative state where you're not identifying with you as necessarily, Neil Kramer or Chipper Dog. You can be just an identity observing itself, and then as you do that, that identity begins to dissolve. Again, as you're no doubt aware, this is a very old practice, but it teaches people experientially that your identity is really a construct that you use to focus consciousness through, and it's not absolutely necessary. It's like an art project, I call it. Your whole life is like an art project. You can kind of do whatever you want with it, and it can be as beautiful or as ugly or as elegant or as crazy as you want. And that's
as long as it's invested by, as long as you invest you into it.
Yes, that's right. If, like any art, if it's going to be real and authentic and good, to use a simple word for it, the artist needs to put mind, body, and spirit, the whole thing, right into the middle of it. And you can tell that no matter what format of art it is. I studied abstract expressionism for 3 years at college, and I'm very, very interested in that. More by what it means than what it is, and more by what it was trying to achieve than what it actually results on the canvas. But it's the same thing. I can tell by looking at a painting who was committed to that and who wasn't. And I think everybody can, quite frankly. And life is the same in that what you look like and what your name is and how much money you've got is kind of irrelevant. What's more significant is how deep you put yourself into your own art projects and how committed you are to that.
Yeah, I find myself having to climb up out of them rather than putting myself into deep.
Well, one has to be careful with that, because then you start to disenfranchise yourself from the whole of normal society. So there are some challenges with that. You don't want to stop brushing your teeth and putting deodorant on, really, do you?
Well, I used a phrase the other day with Cliff talking about the undulating ridge, that it's a walk on. I mean, there is no solid, unshifting line that you can walk. It just just have to get used to that rhythm. Thank you so much, Neil.
You're welcome.
Neil, I'm going to hand you off to Uranus Rising.
Thank you.
Hi, Neil.
Hi.
The other day I read, my personal project is the re-indigenization of the self. Part of that is simply living more with plants as food, friend, and fellow traveler on the way. I really, really resonated with this, and plants are everything to me, and I live in a forest. Synchronistically, that same day, I received some of the plant teacher, Salvia divinorum. So I'm shortly to go to her for some teaching, and I wonder if you have any words of wisdom as I embark on this path.
You know full well that I do.
Yes, I do.
I think the principle of what you're saying is really important, that the re-indigenization, whatever, I can't even pronounce that, to gain a new relationship with our indigenous self and our indigenous connection to the land and so on and so forth, to understand that we're not just modern disconnected people, that we are actually deeply connected to the land and to the environment that we find ourselves. Even if you are in a city, that doesn't change. It just becomes more complex. But if you're fortunate enough to live in a natural environment of whatever ecosystem that presents itself as, then you have the opportunity, because that is relevant right now in your life, whoever you are, wherever you are, you have that opportunity to understand that there's a lot of other stuff that's alive and intelligent around you. And ironically, what appears to be a very simple what I would call second density life form physically, which is a plant, they are the things that are transdimensional in that they exist very strongly and very fluidly in 3 dimensions at the same time, the fourth, third, and second in my formulation of this, which is a model, it's just a way of thinking about this. But how ironic it is to imagine that a plant that grows on the wet slopes of Oaxaca in Mexico is such a profound teacher and is so able to help us heal and help us create the space to receive the signal and help us to progress in the most intimate and personally relevant ways imaginable. And the idea that a plant is going to do this is like a shock to some people. And everybody now has heard about things like ayahuasca and so on. And as I've said before, it's become very popular, that, which is good and bad. But people are hearing about it, which is a good thing, because it's instilling in people the notion that green things that grow out of the ground can actually share information with us. And if you put yourself in the right environment with that, and you educate yourself, and you become familiar with the appropriate techniques of creating that relationship, then it is undeniable how intimate and how profound and how loving, quite frankly, although that's an unusual word for some people right now, at how that relationship manifests itself. And salvia in particular is quite interesting because it's salvinorin A, which is the active psychoactive component in that plant, is incredibly powerful. Maybe one of the most powerful psychoactive substances proportionately to what the plant it's in. And it can bring consciousness to a place, again, when configured correctly, where a lot of regressive therapeutic techniques that take 10 years to properly unfold in the psychiatric environment can be achieved in about 7 minutes. And I have seen many cases of this. I have personal experiences of the advantages of this technique, and I have studied this to some depth from an operational level, not necessarily a kind of ethnobotanical scientific level. I'll leave that to others because that's not the way I work. But if I am going to familiarize myself and acquaint myself with a sacred plant, then I certainly make it my business to know as much about that plant as possible. Just as in the same way that if I was going to acquaint myself with a woman and marry her, I would do exactly the same thing.
Right.
And I would become intimate, and I want to know loads of things, and I want to share experiences, and I want to be open, and I want to be honest, and I want to be sincere. And again, in the same way as a relationship, it's as important to share your weaknesses as it is your strengths. And certainly with that particular plant, it deals very graciously with one's weaknesses and its ability to pinpoint what those are and get to them in such a ornate and graceful manner is mind-boggling, really. And things that I was just not aware of. I don't care what any psychologist might tell me. Things I was not aware of. I have been shown through a plant that grows in the ground. And that is an experience that immediately shifts your perspective on what is intelligent and what lives here and what the order of importance is. Because something so wise that has no brain, that makes you consider seriously how intelligence is formulated and how it's shared. And that, again, you can't really take anybody's word for this. It has to be a felt experience. And of course, always when talking about these things, we have to exercise a little bit of diligence and concern and caution here, because it's not just a drug experience in a recreational manner like hippies would take LSD or clubbers would take MDMA. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a sacred medicine that is extremely powerful. And right. as with any medicine, it's to be taken cautiously and with a high degree of intelligence and with some particular concern about legalities and so on, because some of these things you're not supposed to use. Some of them you can, but only in certain environments. And above all that, of course, your own safety and health. You have to consider those. But once that's done, and once that's achieved, and once you've satisfied yourself that you're doing it in a safe, sane, and legal manner, the experience with salvia and a lot of other plants, quite frankly, I talk about salvia quite a bit, but there are many others, is undeniable as an assistant, as a helper, as a spirit, as a guide here. And it's the beauty of it is that it's totally organic, it's totally natural, and it's totally something that we've had a relationship with for millennia. And the fact that serious psychology and psychiatry and philosophy and science in an academic sense is not recognizing this shows us the depth of that disconnect, and the fact that you have to go to these what were once called savages of the Amazon to get the principal knowledge of it, again shows us how ridiculous our anthropological perceptions were only 100 years ago. But the beauty of these sacred plants is that they're everywhere. Some of them are mushrooms, some of them are vines, some of them are sage plants, some of them are mint plants. And they're all over Europe and America and Africa and all over the place. So each different geographical and cultural region has its own sacred totem, in a sense. And in Europe, it's chiefly, certainly in Britain, it's the mushroom. And that has its own resonances and its own abilities and its own peculiarities, which seem curiously and fascinatingly to be particularly aimed at the Western cultural mindset, whereas ayahuasca is particularly aimed at the, Amazonian basin, South American mindset.
We lost him.
Hello, Neil?
Hello, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I don't know what occurred then.
It sounded like you were talking about the framework within which that cultural awareness came to be.
Yeah, essentially, what I'm saying is that each particular plant seems to be configured specifically for the region and for the cultural accoutrements and for the sociological paradigms that it finds itself in. So it is an interesting and wise move to consider what is the recognized sacred plant medicine for where you live or where you grew up or where you now live. What is it there? You needn't necessarily haul ass out to Ecuador to do a ayahuasca circle. It might not be appropriate for you. Research what is relevant where you are.
This is fascinating, Neil, because even though I'm living in Britain now, I haven't been attracted to the mushrooms. Yet I am extremely attracted to this. And funny enough, I have a very strong connection with Oaxaca and have been there many times. Yes, exactly. And so that in itself is important to me. Also, I want to use it almost as a prayer and as a way to heal one of the deepest pains I have, and that is my disconnect with plants.
Yes, well, I think two important points there. The first one that you raise is really significant, which is we're not talking about physically where somebody is necessarily born with the relevance of the plant that grows there. It's where your mind is at. So if you have an intimate relationship with a certain location, or you have an affinity with a certain mode of thinking, then of course where your plant medicine resonance is going to be slightly different. And certainly for people who travel, and as a Englishman living in America now, I could put myself in that category. My custom-built medicine has changed, and it isn't, psilocybin mushroom. It isn't. It's not part of my journey right now. So I totally get that, and it's a very interesting observance. The other side of it is a very important one as well that you raised, which is the irony and the beauty of saying having what we would call perhaps an entheogenic experience with a plant helps you to reacquaint yourself with the whole plant kingdom. It's a way in to the entire kingdom. And in the same way that you would enter through an airport or a ferry terminal or something, I often get the sense with these things that when approached in that sincerely reverential manner, and when understood to be a sacred movement of consciousness, and you're doing something that I think is magical in the true sense of the word, then you do get the sense that you're going into a space where you're the beginner, really, and you kind of are like the innocent, and you're well looked after there, and it's wise to go in respectful and with some humility. And if you do so, then the kind of welcome and the sort of grace that is bestowed upon you is stunning, really. And after the experience, of course, and with Salvia, that's a relatively short one, that resonance continues, and it helps to build back up that connection. As you say, it's extremely encouraging, and it does change your relationship with the environment you live in. And I now live on the edge of a forest also, by the way, so I do know what you're talking about.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. I'm sitting here with tears in my eyes, and I just feel it's very special. So thank you. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Paul, you got a question for Neil?
Yeah. Hi, Neil.
Hey, Paul.
How are you?
I'm very good. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. I'm in Wales, yeah. The question is, have you considered Christ's references to casting out the first stone and knowing thyself are describing psychological projection and the process of removing ego? And if you have, does that mean that Christ was a Buddhist?
That's a great question. I would say what we perceive Christ as now is probably a long way from what actually he was doing here, if he was a guy indeed. And from the studies that I've made, particularly in the realm of what the Christians would call pre-Christian, early Christian Gnosticism, specifically the Nag Hammadi tractates, then I think that it becomes pretty clear as you're reading through these, because particularly with those texts, you're getting this very broad view from many different angles. So you're getting like alchemical, hermetic, philosophical, Valentinian angles, all kinds of stuff, as well as straightforward Christian perspectives. But you're getting many, many different views of who this guy was and what he was here and what he was doing. And in your question, is this person's ability to map polarity, to absorb negative energy. And if you want to interpret Christianity from a very positive point of view, you could say that examining Christ's transformation of pain is very interesting. And if you want to call that sin or ignorance or unholiness, you can, draw out different conclusions from that. But it's very interesting because whatever he did and whatever interpretation you take on that, if this man was here, whatever his name was and whatever he was doing, if that guy was there, and many of those accounts are legitimate, he was transforming energy at a very primal level, at a very fundamental level, and he was bending physics. And he was an avatar, if you like, in the sense that he was a divine being who was very aware of his avatar status. And you could say, well, it's pretty reasonable to say many avatars come down, and one day we could call it Buddha, and one day we could call that avatar Christ, and another day we could call it Thomas Anderson from The Matrix. You know what I mean? It doesn't really matter what it is. And again, I think you could kind of chase your own tail for an awfully long time trying to figure out what Christ did. And certainly, assuming that the words in the King James Bible are accurate is very foolish indeed now, I think, because that's simply not the case. However, there is a lot of embedded wisdom in there, but it requires a high degree of scholarship to interpret that. And if you really want to do it objectively from a sort of completely bipartisan independent, sovereign perspective, then you need to also do an awful lot of cross-referencing. But yes, the process of removing the ego and communion with the divine is very Buddhist.
Yeah.
Except they don't use the word divine; they just call it Buddhahood. And Buddha, as you probably know, is not a person; it's a title, and it just means enlightened one, essentially. So to be a Buddha is not specific to an individual. There was someone who came down to found it, perhaps, if you might want to look at it that way. But once it's been forged and established, and I mean forge in the sense that you would forge a sword or a hammer, in that you create it and you fabricate it from natural materials and you create that pattern, then you're saying this is what's possible, and this is what we call ascendance, and it's natural, and everyone can do it, and I'm not special, and now I'm out of here, goodbye. And they all kind of say that, and yet the religions that grow up around them do the reverse of that, to say only through Christ can you have salvation, which, going back to what seems a while ago now, we talked about Protestant work ethics, and it was the Calvinists who basically suggested that only through that particular man and through that particular religious doctrine could you have any chance of ascendance, which is the polar opposite of what Christ as a real individual would teach, in my humble opinion.
Yeah. Well, basically, you've answered my next question in that, because I was talking about Christ dying for our sins and whether it was just he was transferring energy from himself and taking energy back. So there's a magnetic charge, and if I could say that. Mm-hmm. So I'll add another part of the question, which is you more or less answered anyway. Have you considered the Hermetica descriptions of the primordial substance and transmutation is describing what was once seen in a more energetic earth?
Yeah, I would. That's very interesting. Yeah. I would agree with that. I would say that the big principle in Hermeticism, separate necessarily from its roots of Egyptian magic, as it's kind of mid. I don't know, let's think, probably 13th, 14th, 15th century alchemists in Western Europe. I would say that if you go back to that source material, the principle from where a lot of the modern alchemy emanates, and for me that doesn't, the foundations of it don't begin with Hermes Trismegistus. I think it goes way further back than that, just like everything else. Yeah. But what the principle, nevertheless, is always the same, which is the thing is shrouded in such concrete metaphor that it's like almost like self-initiation is required to move beyond that. So the principles of saying, hermetic and alchemical principles of saying the Son is the Father is the starting point here. And the solar education necessary to understand the principles of practical alchemy as well as inner alchemy are profound, and they're actually all mapped out in the Emerald Tablet text, which again is a pretty modern interpretation of something that was far older. But they're actually all mapped out in there. But it takes many, many years to appreciate quite how easy it is to oversimplify that. And the beauty of alchemy is that at every level it works. So it works whether you're doing, and there are many of these people still around. I know one guy in Australia does this. There is laboratory alchemy around where people are transmuting materials into other materials. But the real alchemy and the secret of alchemy, and this is an open secret that you can read in the Kybalion, for example, is that the transformation is really the alchemists themselves. It's not what they're working with. It's the alchemist's own consciousness that transforms. So just in the same way, again, to refer to The Matrix, I'm not going to mention this film again for 100 years after this. When Neo speaks to the little boy and he's bending the spoon, the little boy says, it's not the spoon that bends, that's impossible, it's you. It's your mind that changes. It's you that transforms. And when you transform, you can transform anything around you, and you can completely turn the physics inside out if you wish to. And that's the same principle. That is an alchemical principle. And as anyone who's studied the Nag Hammadi text, a lot of it is hermetic wisdom. A lot of it is hermeticism clothed in Christian robes.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I think these things were seen. I've done my own research on it, and I spent 20 years on it. And I think possibly the unveiling of this primordial substance is overdue. And I think we will see the serpents in the sky, and I think they're very much similar to what we're using today as waves, like internet waves or microwaves or whatever. And I think that that's what we will see, and I hope it's not mistaken as an alien invasion.
Yeah, I appreciate that observance. That a lot of the energy that we see manifesting in the world, like you can see, UFOs flying over Eugene in Oregon and Hood River in Oregon and up in Seattle, Washington State. You can see, if you look up, because of the darkness in particularly some of the forested regions, and it's heavily forested over in the Pacific Northwest, for those who don't know, you don't get much light pollution. You see stuff flying over all the time, and you can put your computer on with a little astronomy program that will show you what the stars are and also what satellites are flying over. And then we can also differentiate clearly what aeroplanes are. And 80% of what you see flying over is not any of that stuff. They're not astral bodies, they're not aeroplanes, they're not satellites. And I think the principle, having met some UFO researchers at a recent conference in June in Oregon, Washington State, is that a lot of the UFOs are actually light-based. They're not a material in the sense that we would understand it. And so some UFO researchers are pained by that perception and just think, I don't like that. That's crazy. And the idea that they're like dimensional vessels is also painful for a lot of UFO researchers. So I think it is significant to draw that that illusion between the two, to say there's a relationship between those two things and they can be confused. And if something is going to move through the sky and it's unidentified and it's flying, we call it a UFO, but it doesn't mean that it's a craft with beings from another star system in. It could be a nature spirit. It could be an advanced ascended human being. It could be anything. It could be a part of the natural fourth dimensional order that we just have no clue what it is. So, again, is it human or is it extraterrestrial is another false dichotomy that we have to collapse, really, because it's a lot more fascinating and complex than that.
Yeah, I agree with you. Prana, chi, whatever you want to call it, it's the missing stuff. It's that life force, personally. That's how I see it.
Yeah.
Could I ask you just one question?
Sure.
You spoke in a recent interview about a group of people in Pembrokeshire.
Yeah.
Did one of the older members spend his life moving objects? I just met him, that's all, and I just wanted to know whether it was him.
I'll say this, that the people I'm talking about, it's a general community that is spread throughout some of that place, particularly, from some of the suburban areas, but also out to the peninsula as well. And there seems to be a concentration of people out there. And it's not escaped my notice that if you want to talk about esoteric lineage, that is where a lot of the Druidic peoples went when the Romans came to Britain. And it's rumoured that a lot of their offspring genetically still there. So even though many people may not be aware of it, the strength of spiritual and artistic community there is very strong.
Yeah, I agree. I met an interesting man down there.
Thanks, Paul. We've also interviewed Costas Danos. I think he was one of the 5
students of John Chang, and obviously I'm not sure if you're familiar with John Chang. He moves things and creates fires with his hand and using chi. So interesting stuff. Yeah, Neil, we just got one final question for you. We at the WebBot Forum obviously follow the line of work of Cliff High and the WebBots, and we were just curious to know if you are familiar with Cliff and also the WebBot premise that everybody's psychic and that they leak psychic information about the future and, among other things, into the words they use and the body language they do, etc.
You know what? I'll be totally honest with you. I don't know an awful lot about Cliff's work. I think in the past I've been on one or two alternative media networks or whatever where he's been on as well. And I think I've listened to something a little while ago, maybe a year or two ago, but I'm not actually that familiar with it, which is ironic considering where I am now. I should be all kind of sensible and familiarise myself with that, but I've unfortunately not had the time recently. But no, I'm not familiar with his work at the more core level, if you like. I know that there's this software that can track patterns, and there's a set of algorithms that look into prophetic dissimulation of information and so on. And I also know that there's a blank spot in the near future, and that's about it, really.
The reason why we ask you is you're obviously a great thinker as well, and Cliff uses linguistics, which you're obviously a master of, and he uses linguistics in the sense that the words that people leak out is actually possibly psychic information that comes out, especially because a lot of the time the words that we use are subconsciously placed there. So what do you think of the premise that people are psychic, and number one, they leak it out in their everyday tasks, including the linguistic words they use?
Yeah, the principle of that is absolutely, no problem with that at all. And in fact, I think I could pretty much challenge anyone who had an issue with what we would refer to as the psychic connection between individuals. Give me somebody for half a day and I could completely disprove any notions to the reverse of that. It's so obvious and it's so apparent. And with a little tuning, it's so evidenced in daily life that I think, pretty much everyone accepts that now, and it's through accepting that as a principle that we find ourselves looking at multidimensionality for some people for the first time to say, well, how does that function? Functions very simply by you move consciousness to a fourth density state, and you can move that across any space and through any time period instantly. So it's the mechanics of it, in principle, from a philosophical perspective, I think are relatively explainable. How you actually do that in terms of the physics of it and the quantum physics of it, I also think is relatively explainable. And there are some books on that. Laszlo's book about the Akashic Field is a good introduction to that, of how the physics of that works. And I think it's by certain elements of the shadow governments and control systems and stuff, that physics has been in use for like 60 years now. It's nothing new. But what's more fascinating than that is that the psychic aspects of people and the telekinetic or psychokinetic aspects of human beings is like something that we always had and that we've only just recently lost, really. So that we've had more time of having it than we've had not having it. So I think in the last few thousand years, not having those abilities at your fingertips for everybody is actually quite unusual and quite peculiar. And I think that there are some people now who are moving around the world who you can meet and go and see and listen to them talk, who can show that and show those abilities. So it's directly experienceable now. And if anyone cares to do that, and certainly for those who need the proof, and there's nothing wrong with that, it's not always brilliant, but sometimes it's appropriate to see that with your own eyes. You can go and meet these people. They're around.
We have been speaking with Neil Kramer from neilkramer.com. Thank you for your time tonight, Neil. Hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Otherwise, bad luck, mate. On behalf of Fox and all the members of the WebBot Forum, many of which are autodidacts, we thank you, sir. Before I pass it over to Chipper Dog for a closing poem, in our tradition of pie loving and pie making, may you and your family have many pies to come. Chipper Dog, take it away.
Thank you, Jules. Neil, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciated the sensuality with which you described the plants and a man's love of a woman. I wrote this to my wife. Returns to sender, addressing the known. Writing life's sweet memories on outside leaves of envelopes, licking so fondly as released, sealed within kiss a missive deep. Flowing words of heart-held touches caress missing you so very much, and yet to live within a field of such an awe-full wonder's gentle clutch that vibrates ever silently in growing tones to which come free a resonance that tends to be wrapped inside hearts lived lovingly, that stamps upon unmetered edge in patternings that seem to pledge a modest sloped fringes wild sedge to grow what bakes hot-fired bread, unchecked for in some little box for hints of what are stumbling blocks that turn into those unkeyed stalks, head hidden and kept under locks. And then, to sign in flourishing motion that brings nourishing of energies unhampered spring, to breathe deep in joy, to loudly sing, and sent upon its way. Namaste.
What a wonderful way to end a program.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Neil.
Thanks, guys. I enjoyed talking to all of you. Thanks for your time and your thoughts and questions and your authenticity. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Neil. It's been an honor.
All right.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.